minutes to go over questions. What do we mean by leadership? This is the focus in chapter one, introduction of the last, for example, your chapter uses the presidential election of the last election, the dismay, the candidates, the major political parties they have, and who won. We can't do better than this. It's one of the questions I was posed in your book of the voters, millions of Americans that voted. In fact, however, the collective dismay about the quality of leadership was the question. It's not limited to a particular presidential candidate. It is persuasive, according to the poll by the Center of the Public Leadership. Your book talks about this using the Harvard Kennedy School as an example. 70% of Americans believe that the country is desperate need of a better leadership that faces nation decline unless something changes. In 2013, the Harris poll shows a percentage of people expressing some of the confidence, some of the government issues or corporate issues, financial leadership issues that has plummeted from about the century, the decades, showing 90% to 60% since 1996. Yet we also sometimes see the story as the extraordinary leadership, otherwise ordinary people. In the spring of 1972, an airplane flew across the Andes Mountains carrying a crew of 40 passengers. Most of these passengers were members of the amateur Uruguayan rugby team that played in Chile. The plane never arrived there. It crashed on a snow covered mountain, breaking into several pieces. The impact upon impact. The main part of the fuselage slid to a toboggan down the steep valley, coming to a rest. These was very important that you understand the meaning of leadership in an accidental moment within those days of those impact. 28 of the survivors was not much better. The fuselage offered a little protection from the extreme weather, cold. Food supplies were granted, not enough. A number of passengers had serious injuries from their crash. Over the next days, several of the surviving passengers became more psychotic. Several others died from their injuries. The passengers who were relative injuries set off to do what they could do to improve their condition, that can improve their chances of survival, working together and working in a weather pro or weather or wreckage that needs to be resolved. Water was scarce, medical trainers, those who had medical training, care for the injured. Although the second crash, the survivor initial were confident that they will be found. A plane might go across the air. Feeling gratitude gave them desperate search for these rescue, feeling that someone will find them. These several weeks passed by, no signs of rescue or no sign of sights. Remaining passenger decided to mount an expedition to determine the best way to escape. So they formed, I believe, a three-group chosen to expedite expedition across the mountain, so through the deep snow, and hopefully find someone that can help them. It became a frustrating, demoralizing issue. The expedition members determined that they were in the middle of the Andes Mountain. So they walked and walked and walked and believed the impossible. Just when the survivors thought that nothing worse could possibly happen, an avalanche hit them again, wreckage, and killed several of the surviving members. The remaining survivor concluded that they will not be rescued. Their only hopes was for someone to lead the wreckage. And this expedition plan that was planned in a three group, the fittest was chosen, the final expedition for everyone else to work directly towards improving their conditions. This expedition was hopefully be their chance of success. Food was scarce, example shows in your book in chapter 1 of these activity that shows how the energy was spent securing supply for those trip and for those members who were behind. This expedition is not only important in leadership, it's an attempt to help to survive. Those 10 days, these hikers that were chosen went up these mountains, the terrain, the expedite across different Chilean peasants they ran into. One of this expedition ran into a Chilean cattle and a farm, and they explained how they've been stuck in these mountains for several days. Eventually, 14 other survivors were rescued. When the full account of the survival became known, it was not only without a controversial requirement, it had required extreme settlement, extreme measurements, extreme difficulties. Survivors lived only by the eating the flesh. Some of them, and one of the survivors, is a rugby player, said, uh, "If I died, make sure you eat my body, or else I come back to hunt you after life." This strategy was very important in courage, leadership. Perhaps the story of survival in the Andes is so far removed from all of us, of the everyday experience we might have, of not whole, not seen, or not relevant to the lesson that we're trying to understand in leadership personality. But consider the basic issue of the Andes survivors, what they face, the tension between the individual and the group and the goals, the tension dealing with the different needs, the personality of group survival members, keeping hope alive, facing the adversity. These issues are not only different from those facing many groups. This were part of the condition. We also facing a similarity of experience, of example, energy, emergency, informal leadership in a group, in a setting, in a family. Before the fight, before the flight, one would think that you're going to get on a plane and land. Nonetheless, this become an accidental that shows survival skills and courage skill, optimism, fairness, emotional. All these, what should you want to write down and use in your next week's discussion? Because it shows a decision-making process that's very important of leadership among these survivors, among what you need to become a leader in a difficult situation, agonized decision to make, survival decision. Anybody has a question so far? Anybody listening so far? I guess I was going to stop every 10 and 15 minutes. No question. If you do have questions, very important that you actually use also not only the chat room below to write down your questions. Any questions so far? Anybody listening so far? Anybody here so far? Shannon, are you listening?
I'm listening.
Let me see who else is there. Audiola, are you listening? Farhana, are you listening?
Yes, sir.
Good. Is there any questions so far on leadership? No
No.
questions. So I'm gonna go into introduction that your book shows about leadership that provide numerous examples of leadership in your book. So you want to write this down. Leadership. What is leadership? People who do research on leadership disagree more than you might think about what leadership really is. Most of these disagreements stems from the fact that leadership is a complex phenomenon involving leadership, followers, situation. Some leadership researchers have focused on the idea of the personality, the physical trait of a behavior of leadership. Others have studied the relationship between leaders and followers. So you want to write this down as you use it in your introduction, discussion, and your assignments. The aspect of these situations affects how leadership act. Some have extended the ladder of viewpoints as far as to suggest there is no such thing as leadership. They argue that organizational successes, failures often falsely attributed to the leader, but leader, but the situation have a much greater impact of how the organization functions than does any individual, including the leader. So it's important you think about that. It's pretty deep. Perhaps the best way for you to begin to understand the complexity of leadership is to see some of the leadership, to see this, that define the ways leadership researchers have defined leadership in many different ways. The process by which an agent induce a subordinate to behave is a desire of manner of leadership. Directing the coordinating of work groups is a desire of manner of leadership. The interpersonal relationship in which others comply because they want, they hire to, not because they have to. The process of influence, the organization group towards accomplishments is the goal, but action that focus on resource to create desirable opportunity for leadership, creating those conditions for a team to be effective. The ability to engage in workers, the ability to build a team, a group, the ability to achieve the results. The first two represent how the ladder of leadership. Number one, the complex form of social problem solving, right? As you can see, the definition of leadership differs in many ways. For these differences have resulted in various researchers exploring desirable the aspect of leadership. For example, if we were to apply these definitions to the Andy's story that I told, the survival scenario that I described earlier, some researchers will focus on behavior the Paradieu used to keep the morale of the survivors. Researchers who define leadership as influence the organized group towards accomplishment. It's a goal that will examine how the Paradieu manage to convince a group the stage of support of the final expedition. One definition of leadership might also influence just who is considered appropriate leader for this study. Thus, the group of researchers might also focus on the different style, the aspect of leadership, of each leadership that will tell a different story regarding those leaders. The follower, the situation is also important. Although having leadership definition seems sometimes confusing, it is also important to understand there is no single correct definition. Write that down. No single correct definition. The various definition can help us appreciate and appropriate the multitude factors aspect of leadership. The different aspect from which we understand the view leadership. The example first of this definition just listed the word subordinate. Write down the word subordinate. Seems to continue the leadership style. Downward, upward influence, the hierarchy of relationship. It seems sometimes excluded, informal of those leadership. The second, or right, that's the emphasize direct and coordinated aspect of leadership. Third, thereby may de-emphasize the emotional aspect of leadership. These emphasis place a definition on the subordinate, wanting to comply with the leader. The wishes seems to be excluded many times in a cohesiveness of leadership tool, further becoming more of a problem, identifying ways which we understand leadership. Leadership if subordinates are voluntarily complying, when a leader with these considerate potential cohesiveness power or merely asks others to do something, for example, without explicit threats. We can also reasonably compare this using this phrase, desirable opportunity. One of these definitions in your book defines the precise distinguish between leadership and tyranny. partly because there are many different definitions of leadership. So it's important that you not only read chapter one to find a wide range of individual leadership, but you understand additional stories of the leadership that sprinkle throughout the book to write them down and use them in your discussion. This chapter really finds and focus on the foundation for the whole book, leadership, which highlights it also highlights the founding factors of leadership. I believe your book uses one of those Saudi Arabia leadership factor, showing those leadership both science and leadership, saying that leadership is both science and an art of emphasis of subject of leadership as a field of scholarly inquiry, as well as certain aspect of the practice of leadership. The scope of science of leadership is reflected on a number of studies. Your book uses an 8,000 cited scholar reference that shows a handbook of leadership definition. It's not only important that you read that, you understand the theory research versus the managerial application of leadership. A review theory and research over the past 25 years, as your book has noted, expanding in the breadth of complex leadership, preceding leaderships, century of those examples as your book involves and shows the different theoretical domain theories that wiles the method of leadership. Studying, however, has been understanding those research importances to you, the necessary for being a good leader, the necessity of managing versus leadership, effectiveness shows in your book in chapter one. Without having taken a course of training program in leadership, your book uses this example. Some scholars in the fields of leadership may be relative poor leaders themselves. What more of a new academic models of the leadership, considering those focus on the locus of leadership? Whereby leadership innate as not just coming from an individual leader, whether holding a formal position or not, as well as exploring a later or latter chapter as you focus, but also innating the alternative of from groups, from entirety of those organizations. Nonetheless, knowing something about the leader, about leadership, research is relevant to effective leadership. Scholars have shown may not be a prerequisite of leadership, but effectiveness, but understanding some of the major factor that goes into finding individual better situational leadership. Does anybody has a question so far? I'm gonna go on for another 5 or 10 minutes. As I said, I don't want to go too long today because it's the first lecture for the day. Any questions so far? Adiola, Farhana, Shannon. Anybody listening so far? Am I catching people sleeping today? Anybody sleeping on me today?
That's a question.
And no
Is
one
that a
has a
virtual
question for
background
me?
or is it
Someone
pretty
got to have
quick?
a question about leadership.
Not yet.
All right, let me focus on leadership versus management and trying to answer these
I do.
questions. Go ahead. What was your question?